This content presents World War II historical events for educational purposes only, based on documented records to honor those who served and provide historical insight. This does not glorify violence, promote hatred, or spread misinformation. Viewer discretion advised.
The cargo hold of the Liberty ship smelled of diesel fuel, sweat, and defeat. I had been a proud soldier of the Afrika Korps, convinced of our Führer S-words about American weakness, about their mongrel society too soft for war. We had fought under Rommel in the scorching sands of North Africa, believing ourselves invincible until the inevitable happened. Now, shackled and silent, we crossed an ocean toward the nation we had been taught to despise. The propaganda films had shown us breadlines from the Depression, race riots, a country tearing itself apart. General Rommel himself had told us that America was a sleeping giant made of paper, that their industrial might was a Jewish fabrication, that one German soldier was worth 10 Americans. As the ship's engines thrummed beneath my feet and the Atlantic waves crashed against the hull, I wondered what kind of broken, desperate land awaited us on the other shore. When we finally reached the New York harbor in the summer of 1943, my first glimpse of America struck me like a physical blow. The Statue of Liberty rose from the water, larger than I had imagined, her torch held high in defiance of everything we had been taught. But it wasn't the statue that shattered my expectations. It was everything else. The skyline stretched endlessly, buildings reaching toward the sky like nothing I had seen in Berlin or Munich. Even in wartime, ships crowded the harbor, not military vessels alone, but cargo ships, passenger liners, fishing boats, all moving with purposeful efficiency. There were no ruins, no bombed-out sections, no signs of the devastation that had become normal in European cities. The docks buzzed with activity, cranes lifting cargo, trucks moving supplies, workers of every color moving with casual competence. I had expected to see suffering, rationing, perhaps even hunger. Instead, I saw abundance. The train journey inland deepened my confusion. We traveled 4 days through landscapes that defied every assumption I had carried across the ocean. Farmland stretched to the horizon in every direction, mechanized farms with tractors and combines working fields larger than entire German villages. There were no horses pulling plows, no peasants bent over crops. Everything was mechanized, efficient, impossibly vast. My fellow prisoners pressed their faces against the windows, silent in their disbelief. Hans, who had fought beside me since Tobruk, finally whispered what we were all thinking. They told us Americans were starving. They told us their industry was propaganda. How can we fight a nation that looks like this? Nobody answered because we had no answer. The propaganda had prepared us for weakness, but the reality was overwhelming strength. At night, the train passed through small American towns, and what I saw through those windows haunted me more than any battlefield. Lights everywhere. Lights in Germany, in all of Europe. Blackouts were total. Cities went dark to avoid bomber raids. People lived in shadows, navigating by memory and moonlight. But here, in America, thousands of miles from any threat, lights blazed without fear. Main Street shops displayed their wares behind illuminated windows. Houses glowed warm and golden. Cars drove with headlights cutting through the darkness. It seemed obscene. This casual waste of electricity, this refusal to live in fear. Yet it also revealed something we had not been told. America was so far from the war, so powerful, so secure, that they could afford to light up the night. They could afford to live as if the world wasn't burning. That realization sent a cold spike of doubt through my chest. We had been told victory was inevitable. But how do you defeat a nation that doesn't even need to dim its lights? The camp itself somewhere in the vast Midwest, was nothing like the prison camps we had heard about through whispered rumors of the Eastern Front. Clean barracks, real beds with mattresses, 3 meals a day that were better than what we had eaten as frontline soldiers. The American guards were professional but not cruel, efficient but not sadistic. They processed us with the same casual competence I had seen at the docks, as if managing thousands of enemy prisoners was just another administrative task for a nation that did everything on an incomprehensible scale. That first night, lying on a real bed for the first time in months, I stared at the ceiling and felt the first crack in the ideology that had defined my adult life. If America was this powerful, this organized, this wealthy even in wartime, then everything we had been told was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else had been false? They took us to work at the bomber factory in Willow Run, Michigan, part of the program to use prisoner labor for non-military production. The guards had explained it carefully. We would not be building weapons, only helping with logistics and supply chain management for civilian production. Adjacent to the war effort, I expected a modest facility, perhaps something comparable to the factories I had seen in Germany. What I found instead was something beyond comprehension, a cathedral of American industrial power that made me truly understand for the first time, why Germany had already lost this war. The building stretched for over a mile, the largest factory under one roof in the world. Inside, the noise was deafening. The roar of machinery, the hiss of welding torches, the rhythmic hammering of assembly lines. But it was the scale that broke something inside me. Not the ideology exactly, but the certainty, the unshakable belief that we could win. Every 63 minutes, a complete B-4 Liberator bomber rolled off the assembly line. I watched it happen, unable to believe my eyes, even as the evidence moved past me on the conveyor. In Germany, we celebrated when our factories produced dozens of planes in a month. Here, they produced one every hour. The workers moved with practiced efficiency, each person a cog in a machine so vast that it seemed more like a force of nature than human construction. Women worked alongside men, their hair tied back in bandanas, wielding tools with casual expertise that would have shocked the Reich's leadership. Black Americans worked beside white Americans, their contributions valued and integrated into the production line. Everything I had been taught about racial superiority, about the weakness of mixed societies, crumbled in the face of this coordinated power. During lunch breaks, I talked with the civilian workers when the guards allowed it. They were friendly, curious about Germany, eager to practice the few German words they knew. One man, a line foreman named Jack, told me his family story over sandwiches that were larger and more filling than anything I had eaten in the His grandfather had come from Germany 2 generations ago, worked in steel mills, saved money, bought a house. Now Jack owned that house, had a car in the garage, sent his kids to school for free. "That's the American deal," he said, his accent strange but understandable. "You work hard, you get ahead. Nobody cares where your grandfather came from." He said it so casually, as if this was obvious, natural. But to me, raised in a society obsessed with bloodlines and ancestry, it was revolutionary. Here was a system that rewarded merit over breeding, where a factory worker lived better than German aristocrats, where opportunity wasn't rationed by birth. The numbers they showed us during orientation were almost abstract in their enormity. This single factory would produce over 8,000 bombers by war's end. That was more aircraft than Germany had produced in total since the war began. The Ford River Rouge complex, which some of us had seen during transport, covered over 2,000 acres and employed 100,000 workers. It produced a complete vehicle every 63 seconds. America had more than 400,000 aircraft production workers. Germany had less than a tenth of that. The mathematics of the war became suddenly, brutally clear. This wasn't a conflict of ideologies anymore. It was arithmetic, and the numbers did not favor the Reich. Every bomber I watched roll off that line was another hammer blow against the propaganda we had consumed. They had told us American industry was a myth, that Jewish capitalism had weakened their productive capacity. The reality was the opposite. American capitalism had created the most powerful industrial base in human history. At night, back in the barracks, we would argue about what we had seen. Some of the older prisoners, hardcore National Socialists who had joined the party in the 20s, rejected everything. It's staged, they insisted. They're showing us propaganda, making us think they're stronger than they are. But most of us, especially those who had actually seen combat, knew better. You cannot fake an entire bomber rolling off an assembly line every hour. You can not stage cities of lights and endless farmland and workers who live in their own houses with their own cars. The evidence was too overwhelming, too consistent, too real. We had been lied to comprehensively and completely about the nature of our enemy. And if we had been lied to about this, what other lies had we swallowed without question? The Americans assigned us to agricultural work during harvest season, sending groups of prisoners to help with crops in exchange for wages we could spend at the camp canteen. It was voluntary. They asked for volunteers rather than demanding labor, which itself was strange. In the Wehrmacht, orders were orders. Here, even prisoners had choices. I volunteered because I had grown up on a farm in Bavaria and missed the feel of soil under my fingers. What I found in Kansas was not a farm. It was an industrial operation that made German agriculture look medieval by comparison. The farmer who took our group, a weathered man named Henderson, owned 2,000 acres. 2,000 acres. That was larger than the village where I had grown up, larger than estates owned by German nobility. And Henderson was not nobility. He was a common farmer, third generation, who drove a tractor that cost more than most German houses. The machinery was what struck me first. Combines that could harvest more wheat in an hour than a dozen men could manage in a day. Mechanical planters, irrigation systems that stretched across horizons, silos that could hold enough grain to feed a city. Henderson operated all this with his 2 sons and seasonal help. In Germany, an operation this size would require hundreds of workers, dozens of families, an entire feudal system. Here, technology had replaced manpower, efficiency had replaced tradition. During a water break, Henderson showed me his accounts. Proud of his operation, he produced enough wheat annually to feed 5,000 people, and he was just one of hundreds of thousands of similar farmers across the American Midwest. The scale was incomprehensible. Germany, with its smaller farms and limited mechanization, could never match this production. America could feed itself, feed its allies, feed its military, and still have surplus to spare. The meals we received as prisoners reflected this agricultural abundance. 3 times daily, we ate better than we had as soldiers in the Afrika Korps. Breakfast included eggs, bacon, bread, butter, coffee with real cream. Lunch was sandwiches with meat, cheese, vegetables, fruit. Dinner featured portions of chicken or beef that would have been considered generous even before the war. The Americans apologized that rationing affected the quality of the food. Rationing. They called this abundance rationing. Hans, eating his 3rd full meal of the day, looked at me with hollow eyes and said, "My sister's children in Hamburg are eating potato peels and turnip soup. Here, prisoners of war eat steak." The injustice of it or perhaps the justice of it, was overwhelming. We had started this war. We had invaded our neighbors, and yet we were treated with more humanity than our own government showed its citizens. Henderson invited us to Sunday dinner at his house, a gesture of hospitality that seemed insane. Two men trained to see Americans as enemies. His wife, a kind woman named Dorothy, served a meal that belonged in a palace: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans from their garden, fresh bread, apple pie for dessert. They said grace before eating, thanking God for the food and for peace to come. Then Henderson asked about our families, about Germany, about our lives before the war. He listened without judgment, without hatred, treating us as human beings rather than enemy soldiers. His teenage son asked about the war, curious rather than hostile. They wanted to understand, not to condemn. After dinner, Henderson showed me his barn, his pride evident in every modern convenience: electric lights, concrete floors, mechanical milking machines. German engineering helped build some of this, he said, gesturing to his tractor. Your people make good machines. When this war is over, maybe we can trade in peace instead of fight in war. That night, walking back to camp under stars that seemed brighter in the clear Kansas sky, I felt the last foundations of my Nazi ideology crumble into dust. The propaganda had taught us that democracy made nations weak, that racial mixing destroyed social cohesion, that capitalism created poverty and suffering. But I had seen the truth with my own eyes. Democracy had created the most powerful nation in human history. Racial diversity had built factories and farms that dwarfed anything in the supposedly pure Reich. Capitalism had generated wealth so vast that even prisoners of war lived better than German citizens. And perhaps most damning of all, this American farmer, this common man with no special breeding or party membership, had shown more human decency to enemy soldiers than the Führer had ever shown to his own people. The ideology I had risked my life for was not just wrong, it was the opposite of truth. And that realization was more terrifying than any battle I had faced in Africa. The American program of re-education began subtly, so subtly that we hardly noticed it was happening. There were no forced indoctrination sessions, no lengthy propaganda films, no torture or Instead, they gave us books, American literature, political philosophy, history texts that presented perspectives we had never encountered in the Reich. Libraries opened in the larger camps, stocked with thousands of volumes in German and English. For men starved of intellectual stimulation after years of military service, these books were irresistible. I read Whitman and Emerson, Lincoln's speeches, and the Federalist Papers. I read about American history, about the Revolution and the Civil War, about waves of immigrants building something new from nothing. The books did not explicitly argue against National Socialism. They simply presented an alternative vision of how humans could organize their societies, one based on individual liberty rather than collective submission. The camp newspaper, Der Ruf, began publication in written by German prisoners, but with editorial oversight from American officers who ensured factual accuracy while allowing genuine German voices. I started writing for it, small pieces at first about camp life and memories of home. But gradually, as I read more and understood more, my writing evolved. I wrote about the disconnect between Nazi propaganda and American reality. I wrote about the possibility of a different Germany, one that embraced democracy rather than dictatorship. Other prisoners contributed similar pieces, and we began to see ourselves not as defeated soldiers but as potential builders of a new future. The Americans encouraged this, recognizing that the best ambassadors for democracy were Germans who had chosen it themselves rather than having it imposed on them. The screening process intensified as the war drew to a close. American intelligence officers interviewed prisoners individually, assessing our political reliability and openness to democratic ideas. They divided us into 3 categories: white for those who had embraced democratic principles, gray for those who were uncertain, and black for hardcore Nazis who remained committed to the ideology. The categories determined where we were housed and what opportunities we received. White prisoners got additional education, including university courses taught by German refugee professors who had fled the Reich. We learned economics, political science, philosophy, history, untainted by Nazi revisionism. We studied the Weimar Republic's failures and discussed how a future Germany might avoid those mistakes. These were not lectures, but discussions. Genuine exchanges of ideas where we were treated as thinking adults capable of forming our own conclusions. Some prisoners rejected the entire process, calling us traitors for even engaging with American ideas. Hans, my old comrade from Afrika, was one of them. He sat in the barracks at night, refusing to read the books, refusing to attend the discussions, clinging to the ideology even as evidence mounted against it. "They're brainwashing you," he insisted. "This is all a trick to make us betray the fatherland." But his arguments sounded increasingly hollow, even to himself. How could truth be brainwashing? How could facts be betrayal? The Americans had not forced us to believe anything. They had simply shown us reality and let us draw our own conclusions. The strongest among us, I realized, were not those who clung to old beliefs despite contradicting evidence, but those who had the courage to admit they had been wrong. By 1945, as news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached us, the transformation was nearly complete. We mourned for our nation, for the cities destroyed, and the people dead, for the waste of it all. But we did not mourn for the Reich. That edifice of lies and hatred had earned its destruction. In quiet conversations, we began planning for the future. Some wanted to stay in America, to immigrate and build new lives in the nation that had shown us another way. Others, myself included, felt called to return to Germany and help rebuild it on better foundations. The Americans had given us tools, education, perspective, understanding of democratic principles that would be desperately needed in the ruins of the Reich. We would go home not as defeated soldiers, but as missionaries of democracy, carrying the virus of free thought back into the heart of the fallen dictatorship. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the Americans began showing us films and photographs from the liberated concentration camps. They gathered us in groups, mandatory viewings that we could not avoid or ignore. The first images appeared on the screen: skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, mass graves, survivors who looked more dead than alive, the industrial apparatus of genocide laid bare. I watched in numb horror as the camera panned across Bergen-Belsen. These were not Allied propaganda. These were German camps, built and operated by the regime I had served. The officers I had saluted had known about this. The government I had defended had created this, and I, in my willing ignorance, had been complicit through my service. Many prisoners reacted with outright denial. Jewish propaganda, some shouted, staged by the Allies to make us look bad. But the evidence was too overwhelming, too detailed, too consistent. The Americans brought in witnesses, German civilians who had lived near the camps, railway workers who had transported prisoners, even some of the guards who had operated the facilities. They testified about what they had seen and done. Their words, matter-of-fact, bureaucratic, more chilling than any passionate accusation could have been. We were following orders. one former guard explained. The prisoners were enemies of the Reich. We did what we were told. That phrase, "we were following orders," echoed through the room. It was the same justification we had all used, the same abdication of personal responsibility. How many atrocities could be justified by obedience? I thought about my own service, searching my memory for signs I should have noticed. There had been whispers, rumors about special camps in the East, stories that circulated among soldiers but were never confirmed. I had dismissed them as exaggerations, as the kind of dark humor soldiers develop in wartime. Now, I understood they had been warnings, testimonies I had chosen not to hear, because hearing them would have required action, would have required me to question everything. My ignorance had not been innocent. It had been willful, a choice to remain blind because seeing would have been too costly. Every day I had worn the uniform. Every order I had followed. Every battle I had fought, all of it had sustained a regime that built factories for murder. The psychological impact on the prisoner population was profound and divisive. Some men broke completely, weeping uncontrollably, unable to reconcile the soldiers they had believed themselves to be with the reality of what they had served. Others hardened further, retreating into denial so complete that no evidence could penetrate it. But most of us existed in a terrible middle ground, trying to process the guilt and shame while still maintaining some sense of self-worth. We had been soldiers, not guards. We had fought other soldiers, not murdered civilians. But the distinction felt hollow. We had been part of the machine, and the machine had committed monstrous evil. No amount of personal innocence could erase that collective guilt. The Americans handled this revelation with calculated intent. They were not showing us these images to punish us, though punishment would have been justified. They were showing us to ensure we understood the full nature of what we had supported, so that we could never again claim ignorance, never again follow orders without questioning them. It was part of the re-education, the most brutal and necessary part. Democracy requires citizens who think for themselves, who question authority, who recognize that obedience to evil orders is not virtue but cowardice. We had to confront our complicity before we could move beyond it. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, and understood that whatever future I built, it would have to be on the ruins of everything I had once believed. The soldier I had been was dead. What I would become was still uncertain. By the time repatriation began in 1946, I was no longer the man who had arrived in America 3 years earlier. The transformation had not been sudden or dramatic, but cumulative, each experience and observation adding another layer of understanding that eventually became too heavy to ignore. I had volunteered for the Intellectual Diversion Program, an American initiative that offered advanced education to prisoners who showed aptitude and openness to democratic principles. Through this program, I studied political science and economics at a level that would have been impossible in Nazi Germany, where education was filtered through ideological purity tests. My instructors were German refugees, professors who had fled the Reich in the 30s, and they taught with a passion born from watching their homeland descend into madness. Professor Steinberg, who had taught at Heidelberg before fleeing to America, became my mentor. He was Jewish, which made our relationship complicated in ways that took me months to process. The first time he sat across from me in the camp library, offering to tutor me in constitutional law, I felt a visceral discomfort that I now recognize as programmed hatred confronting human reality. But Steinberg was patient, treating my ignorance as a curable condition rather than a moral failure. He taught me about the Weimar Constitution, about how democracy had failed in Germany not because democracy was weak, but because Germans had not believed in it strongly enough to defend it. "You have a choice," he told me during one session. "You can return to Germany as a victim, angry and resentful, or you can return as a builder, committed to ensuring this never happens again. The first path is easy and leads to nothing. The second is hard and leads to everything. The camp held mock elections to teach us democratic processes. We formed parties, debated issues, campaigned for votes, and elected representatives to handle camp affairs within the bounds of American military authority. It was artificial, a simulation, but it taught essential lessons about compromise, about loyal opposition, about the peaceful transfer of power. I joined the Social Democratic faction, arguing for economic reform and civil liberties. We lost the first election, but won the second, and both times the transition happened without violence or purges. It seemed miraculous. This idea that political opponents could coexist without destroying each other. In the Reich, losing political power meant losing everything: position, property, possibly life. Here, it just meant trying again next time. As repatriation approached, we received word about conditions in Germany. The cities were ruined, the economy destroyed, the population traumatized. The Allies had divided the country into zones of occupation. Reports from the Soviet zone were disturbing: censorship, political arrests, the imposition of communist dictatorship under a different flag. But in the Western zones, under American, British, and French control, something different was emerging. Democratic institutions were being built, local elections held, freedom of speech and press established. The Marshall Plan was being debated, massive American economic aid to rebuild Europe. After spending 3 years seeing American abundance, I believed they could do it. They had the resources, the will, and the understanding that a democratic Germany was in everyone's interest. The Americans offered me a choice that would define my future. I could return to Germany immediately, or stay in America for an additional year of advanced study at a university, preparing me to take a role in rebuilding German civil society. It was an extraordinary opportunity, and I accepted immediately. They sent me to the University of Wisconsin, where I lived not as a prisoner, but as a student, studying alongside American veterans who had fought against me just months before. We became friends, sharing stories over beer, laughing at the absurdity of our situation. Tom had been at Normandy. Jerry had flown bombing missions over Berlin. And here we were, studying together, planning our futures, finding common ground in our shared exhaustion with war. If former enemies could become friends this quickly, then perhaps nations could do the same. Perhaps the cycle of European wars could finally end. Perhaps, I dare to think, I could be part of building that peace. I returned to Germany in the summer of 1947, traveling by ship across the Atlantic in reverse, this time as a free man rather than a prisoner. The country I found was both familiar and alien. Hamburg, where I disembarked, was a landscape of rubble punctuated by occasional standing walls. Children played in the ruins. Women sorted through debris looking for anything salvageable. The population looked defeated in a way that went beyond military loss. People moved mechanically, their eyes hollow, their hope extinguished. I had seen death in combat, had witnessed the aftermath of battles, but this systematic destruction of an entire society was something different. This was what total war looked like when you lost it completely. I made my way to Berlin, where I had connections with other former prisoners who had returned earlier. The city was divided, occupied by 4 powers. Checkpoints and barriers, already creating the geography of the Cold War that would define the next decades. In the American sector, I found others like me, veterans of the American prison camp system who had been transformed by the experience. We formed discussion groups, organized political meetings, began building networks that would eventually become the foundation of West German democracy. The occupation authorities supported us cautiously, recognizing that German democracy would have to be built by Germans, not imposed by occupiers. We were their bet, their investment in the possibility that people could change. The process of political reconstruction was chaotic and frustrating. We faced opposition from multiple directions. Hardcore Nazis who had survived the collapse still held on to their ideology, meeting in secret, plotting returns to power that would thankfully never materialize. Communists from the East pushed their own brand of authoritarianism, promising social justice while establishing police states, and many ordinary Germans just wanted to forget, to move on, to rebuild their lives without confronting the past. We argued for a different path, facing the truth about the Nazi era, establishing democratic institutions, creating a social market economy that combined capitalism's efficiency with strong social protections. It was a hard sell to a traumatized population, but we persisted. I became involved in adult education, teaching courses on democratic theory and practice to Germans who had lived their entire adult lives under dictatorship. Many of my students were older than me, veterans of the First World War or workers who had joined the Nazi Party because everyone did. They listened with skepticism at first, their faces reflecting doubt that democracy could work in Germany. But I had the advantage of having seen it work in America. I could describe not just theories, but realities. The elections I had participated in, the newspapers that criticized their government without fear, the courts that held leaders accountable, the businesses that thrived under democratic regulation. I could tell them about Henderson the farmer and Jack the foreman, ordinary men living extraordinary lives because their system allowed human potential to flourish. Slowly, some began to believe that Germany could have that too. The transformation of Germany from dictatorship to democracy was not smooth or guaranteed. There were setbacks, scandals, moments when it seemed like the old patterns would reassert themselves. But the foundation held, built by people like me who had learned democracy as prisoners and returned as teachers. When the Basic Law was ratified in 1949, establishing the Federal Republic of Germany, I attended the ceremony in Bonn with tears in my eyes. We had done it. Out of total defeat, out of ashes and ruins and collective guilt, we had built something new, not perfect, not unblemished, but genuinely democratic and genuinely German. The young soldier who had arrived in America in 1943, full of Nazi propaganda and full certainty, had become a builder of the very democracy he had once fought against. Decades later, looking back across the years from the vantage point of a united, democratic Germany, I understand that the real victory of the Second World War was not won on battlefields. It was won in factory tours and farm fields, in libraries and classrooms, in the simple act of treating enemies as human beings capable of redemption. The Americans could have brutalized us, could have created in us the same hatred that the Nazis had cultivated. Instead, they showed us abundance where we expected deprivation, freedom where we expected oppression, humanity where we expected vengeance. That generosity, that confidence in democratic values proved more powerful than any weapon. Of the 371,683 German prisoners held in America, only 2,222 attempted escape, a rate of 0.6% that speaks volumes about how we were treated. Many of us became lifelong advocates for German-American friendship, for European integration, for democratic values. Walter Haustink, who, like me, had been a prisoner in America, became the first president of the European Commission, helping to build the unified Europe that has kept peace for 75 years. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, another former prisoner, became Germany's longest-serving foreign minister, a champion of democracy and human rights. We are not unique. Thousands of former prisoners of war carried the lessons we learned in America back to Germany and used them to build a better nation. The program succeeded not because of its explicit re-education efforts, though those mattered, but because it trusted in the power of reality to overcome propaganda. The Americans did not tell us their system was superior. They simply showed us their system and let us draw our own conclusions. They did not force democracy on us. They demonstrated democracy and allowed us to choose it for ourselves. That respect for human agency, for the capacity of people to recognize truth when they see it, was itself a democratic principle in action. It showed us that democracy was not just a political system, but a philosophy of human dignity. I am an old man now, watching my grandchildren grow up in a Germany that bears little resemblance to the nation I served as a young soldier. They learn about the Nazi era in school, confronting the darkness without flinching. They travel freely across Europe, studying in France and working in Italy, part of a generation that cannot imagine war between European nations. They live in a democracy so stable that it seems natural, obvious, the only way a society could organize itself. They do not understand how fragile it all is, how easily it could have been different. But I remember the soldier I was and the man I became. I remember America's abundance and America's generosity. I remember the choice offered and the choice made. The true measure of victory in war is not just defeating your enemy, but transforming them into friends and allies. By that measure, America's triumph was complete. The arsenal of democracy produced not just the weapons that won the war, but the ideas and the example that won the peace. We, prisoners of war, were not collateral damage in that victory. We were its finest products. Transformed by experience, educated by example, we returned to Germany carrying the virus of democracy that would ultimately inoculate our nation against the disease of totalitarianism. That transformation, more than any battle or bombing campaign, ensured that the sacrifices of the war would lead to something better than mere victory. They led to reconciliation, to partnership, to a peace that has endured longer than any in European history. If you found this story meaningful, I invite you to reflect on its lessons for our own time. Democracy is never guaranteed. It must be chosen again and again by each generation, by each individual. The arsenal that broke the Iron Cross was not made of steel and fire, but of principles and possibilities. Those weapons remain available to us today. If we have the courage to wield them, share this story with others who need to hear it. Remember that enemies can become allies, that people can change, that showing rather than telling is the most powerful form of persuasion. The transformation of 371,683 prisoners proves that redemption is possible, that second chances matter, that the future does not have to repeat the past. That is the legacy of the arsenal of democracy. Not just that it won a war, but that it showed a better way to build a peace.